Please welcome our speaker with huge round of applause.
Okay, so once again, welcome. I'm Stefanie Molin, and the talk is about getting started in open source contributions. So a little bit about me before we dive in. I'm a full stack software engineer at Bloomberg in New York City. I'm one of the core developers of NumPy, which we'll talk a little bit about in this presentation. And I'm also the author of Hands-on Data Analysis with Pandas. So I want to start by dispelling some myths around open source contributions. So the first myth is that you have to be a professional developer or maintainer in order to contribute to open source projects. And just as you don't need to be one of those to use open source projects, you also don't need to be to contribute to them. There are a variety of ways to contribute that are available to people of all different skill sets and experience levels. The second myth is that only experts can contribute something meaningful. And once again, this is false, because as a non-expert, you provide a very unique perspective that the experts will have trouble replicating. When you think about something like writing a getting started guide for a new project, who's going to have a better way of describing what issues newcomers are going to come across than a newcomer or someone who is recently a newcomer? It is very challenging for an expert to put themselves in the position of a newcomer. So with that, I want to start with what is the hardest part of doing open source contributions. And it's not actually making the contribution. It's finding something to work on in the first place. And this is especially the case if you limit yourself to just thinking about code contributions. It's very possible to contribute heavily to something even if you don't know how to write the language that it's written in. So some ways that you can contribute include improving or translating documentation, making tutorials, building a community around a project, and also reporting bugs. So the first thing that you can do is sit down and brainstorm. What are some projects that you've used recently? And at this point, don't even think about, well, I don't know this language, or I'm not too familiar with the internals of how this works. Just whatever pops into your head that you've used recently, you write it down. And this list doesn't have to be 5, it can be longer, it could be less. And once you have that list, then you can start evaluating those for suitability. What is going to be reasonable for you to work on? And here are 5 things I like to consider at this stage. The first is the software license. So you may be working somewhere where there's restrictions on what types of things you can contribute to, depending on the license that the software is distributed under. You want to check for recent activity. So let's say there was a package that you're interested in contributing to. It's available on PyPI. And you go and look at the page on PyPI and see that they haven't published anything in 3 years. So that could mean a couple of things. Maybe it's pretty much feature complete and there's nothing to do, in which case you're not really going to be able to do much there. Or it's not used anymore and it's been abandoned. You also don't want to waste your time on that. So kind of use that activity level as an idea of, if you were to write something, how quickly would it get attention, and is it going to move forward? The third thing to consider is the code base size. So something that has a very large code base will potentially have more things to work on, but on the flip side, it's going to be harder for you to get a foothold, because you're going to have a lot more code that you need to read through and understand what's going on. But I like to think of the code base size in combination with the tech stack. So for example, if you're looking at a library like Seaborn, which is a data visualization library in Python, perhaps you're not too familiar with Seaborn, but you may know a lot of matplotlib. And Seaborn is built on top of matplotlib. So even if you don't know Seaborn itself, you're still in a very good position to be able to contribute to the library if you know matplotlib. And the final thing is to make sure that you can actually access the code for the repository. So from PyPI, you might find a link to the repository. It doesn't have to be in GitHub, but if there's no repository that's public at all, then obviously you can't contribute to it. So hopefully, after going through those 5 steps, you have still something in your list that is a suitable option. And at this point, I want to walk you through the 5 strategies that I've used to get started contributing to different open source projects in Python. And the first one is to participate in sprints. And very lucky that at this event there is a sprint on Sunday. So if you're around, be sure to check that out. So I did my first sprint at EuroPython in July 2022. And let's see if I can point from here. Yeah, that's me in the back, and these two directly across from me are scikit-learn maintainers. So in this particular sprint, they had us working on documentation. In particular, they wanted to make sure that all of their doc strings were compliant with NumPyDoc standard. And to do this, they had written a script where it would go and check each of the classes that they had and validate that, run NumPyDoc on it basically, and validate that they complied to the standard. So I had done one of these successfully, and I was working on my second, and I couldn't figure out why I was failing. It kept saying that it wasn't ending in a period, and visually, it looked like it ended in a period. I called over one of the maintainers, we stared at it for a while, couldn't figure out what was going on, if there was a bug in the script, whatever. Eventually, I decided just to scrap the whole thing and start over. And what it was that there was a trailing white space at the end of the period. So the tool was like, you're not ending in a period. It didn't say that it was ending in a space. So having the maintainers there, I asked, how do you avoid this happening? And I was told to look into pre-commit. And then at this point, I pretty much had ended the sprint for the day. So I went home and read up about pre-commit. And I got very excited about it. I used it on some personal projects, brought it to work, and eventually ended up contributing pre-commit setups to other projects. So learning what I learned in that one sprint allowed me to make several other open source contributions as well. So I had an absolutely fantastic experience at this sprint. And like I said, it was my first one. And it was very well organized, and it encouraged me to keep doing that and get involved. So if you do have the chance, which you all do, and hopefully your travel arrangements allow, I would highly suggest going to the sprint tomorrow. Regardless of your experience, you're going to learn something. So some tips to have a successful sprint experience. The first thing is to pick a project that interests you. You are going to be limited to obviously what's offered, but you can always, if you feel so inclined, just start your own sprint on something you'd be curious to work on. Being interested will help you be motivated to actually push through and get a PR in by the end of the sprint, but then also afterwards, you can continue working on the project because it will be something that you're passionate about. In general, look for beginner-friendly projects. I would say regardless of your experience level, look for this, because the term beginner is a loaded term. It might mean beginner in the sense that the project is willing to help you figure out how to use Git and GitHub for the first time. It might mean that the project is open to people who've never used the project before but are familiar with development. So you have to get that clarification. You can talk with whoever's running the sprint to be sure. And that's one of the huge benefits of having the sprint, particularly if there are maintainers or people heavily involved with the project around, is that you have an opportunity to directly ask someone and get immediate feedback about what are you doing wrong, or is there a tool that they like using? How do they navigate the code base? When you're in that environment and you have them right next to you, like I did there, you get that immediate feedback, right? You're not waiting 12 hours until they wake up or something. And that makes for a much better experience, especially as a beginner when you need that quick turnaround. And it's important to go in with an open mind. So as I said, regardless of your experience level, you're going to learn something new. You might even teach the people running it something. Maybe you use this tool that's new, or you're really into it and you've read a lot about it and they don't know, and you can share that knowledge. It's a very friendly environment and everyone wants to help each other out. And if you're not sure how to proceed in something, you can always ask for help, because the maintainers or the project lead come to that sprint with the goal of accomplishing maybe some certain piece of work. So both sides are invested. They want to get that work done, and you want to contribute. So the second strategy is to contribute examples to the documentation. So I'm sure everyone here has at least once looked at a project's documentation and been confused about something about how to use it. Maybe the example, while it was there, wasn't that great. It could have been improved. One example I'll show here is I was using NumPy's polynomial degree function. And at the time, the examples on the bottom didn't exist. And I was trying to figure out two things. First, which order did the coefficients of the polynomial need to be provided? Was it lowest degree to highest degree, or the reverse? And what happened when one of the degrees was 0 at the end? there was nothing in the documentation, so I had to open up Python and run the examples I came up with myself to figure out the answer to this question, which is obviously hugely inefficient. This is going to happen again. Students, potentially myself in the future, would go and come across and not understand how to use this. So I took those examples that I made for myself, and I submitted a PR to NumPy. And they were very grateful to receive that. A big project like that, there's going to be spots that don't yet have documentation. And this is a great way both for you to learn how a certain functionality you've never touched works, and also to contribute. So there's a bit of a paradox with the documentation. So every project needs good documentation, but it also takes a ton of time to actually write good documentation. So what you'll see happening is that in order to move the project forward, the documentation often gets deprioritized, which on the flip side makes it a great opportunity if you want to get started contributing to a project. Because now there's entire spots that might have no examples or that need refinement, and you can easily swoop in and put those examples there. And one thing I particularly like to do is you can find a part of the documentation that has no examples, even if you don't know it, and then read up. You benefit in two ways. You learn how a new piece of the library works that you didn't know about before, and then by putting the examples in, you also help other people learn from that. So the third strategy is to browse open issues for ideas. So here I have a screenshot of Scikit-Learn's GitHub, and at the time they had up here 1.6 thousand issues, and I'm sure this is way more because this was a little over a year ago at this point. So obviously I don't expect anyone to read 1.6 thousand issues. That's impossible. So you need to have a way to filter this down. So let's see if the mouse will work on this one. Yeah. So one thing you can do is click labels over here. So you see how there's 100. That's much smaller than 1.6 thousand, right? And this is something that you can actually easily scan because you'll have the label, and then there's usually a description of what the label means to that project. So then you can use this and figure out which labels am I interested in looking into. Once you have that, then you can actually search. So for example, what's in the screenshot here is I'm only searching for the label called good first issue. Now, you will see that in a lot of repos, but there is no mandatory labels that must exist. The project is free to rename them, delete them, whatever, but this is a good one to search for. So as you can see, we went from 1.6 thousand to 3, right? This is way more manageable to look at. And then at this point, what I like to do is focus on the comments over here. So in general, I like to look for things that have little to no comments, and that's because if it has no comments, that definitely means no one's claimed it. And at least if it has a few, it might just be some clarifications. Now you'll notice that there's one in the middle, it says 227 comments. And that is actually one I'd recommend looking at. So there's a key caveat here, that in particularly Scikit-Learn uses this meta issue tag. And what's great about the meta issue is it's essentially one task that they want to do, but on tons of different files. So even the odds are that you will come in, and some of them will already be done, which means that when you come in, you have examples of PRs that have already been merged that you can consult to figure out how to actually go about making the change. Okay, so in general, some tips. So I would say look for, and again, you're going to have to look each individual repository, things like beginner, easy, good first issue. And I want to add a caveat on easy. Easy is something you have to take with a grain of salt. It might be something that is easy in terms of the project, or something that the maintainers think is easy. I once contributed a pre-commit setup to a library called Yellowbrick, which does some Scikit-Learn visualizations. And they had said, we'd love to have a pre-commit setup, and they put it as hard. And for me, I saw that, I'm like, wow, this is easy, right? Because it was because the maintainer group did not know how to do that. So I wouldn't necessarily rule out looking at things that say hard, any kind of level like that. I think maybe beginner is a little bit more accurate of what you're looking for if you're new to the library. But again, you will have to look. So maybe you click on easy just to get a feel for what it is, and then you know how that project treats that tag. Another key thing here is to not disregard old issues. So just like with a search engine, people only tend to look at the first page of results. And I've had success on multiple occasions of looking further down. So in one case, so actually the pre-commit for the yellow brick that I mentioned, that was, I think, years old when I approached it. And they were like, yes, please do this for us. With Seaborn, I ended up finding a task at the very end of their backlog, which was roughly 9 months old. But it was entered by the maintainer himself. And it was asking for something that I knew right away was just an easy thing to do in matplotlib. So I asked on the issue, is this still something you're interested in? So that's the key. If it's old, definitely ask. When you get that yes, then go ahead. Now you've claimed your issue. I talked before about the meta issues, right? If you see anything resembling this in another project, definitely look into that. Like I said, you're going to have a template of what you need to do, and you'll have references from other people. And scikit-learn does a very, very good job. So if you're maybe looking for your very, very first one, you can see if they have meta issues that they classify as easy, and you will have lots of examples to go off of. With anything that you do here, once you find something you're interested on, make sure that you comment on the issue. So let people know that you're working on that. This is a great way to signal to the maintainers as well that you're working on it. And if you need help, you can then ask for help right at that point. Like, I'm interested in working on this, but I'm not sure how to get started. And they can provide you assistance. So I also have a link here to an article I wrote recently about more about how you can navigate that issue tracker with screenshots and labels and stuff. So you can check that out. So the fourth strategy is to identify and fix a bug. So now we've moved to something that we're now requiring more familiarity with the project. There are still the easy ones in this case of like documentation. Maybe you start reading the documentation, you see typos, omissions. That's something you can fix without having too deep knowledge of the project. But to stumble across something that isn't working correctly that also no one else has found is going to require a lot heavier use of the project. So in my use case, I was using pandas to make a quick plot, a horizontal bar plot, and I couldn't figure out how to get the axes labeled correctly. I was giving it an x-axis label, and that was ending up on the y-axis, and then I gave it a y-axis label, and that just disappeared entirely. So something was clearly wrong. And the fact that pandas is rarely used for those visuals, it's usually, very few people even know that it exists. So this was something that there was no previous bug report for, and so I was able to go ahead and file the bug report. Now, different repositories will have different templates, so this is the pandas template. So you'll just have to make sure you give them the information that they're asking for. So again, you want to check that it hasn't already been reported. And this means you have to go through open and closed issues. And you should also check that the issue exists on the main branch of the project, as in it hasn't already been fixed like one pull request ago. When you see that you do have something that is indeed unique, then you're going to put in your bug report. And at this place, you want to make sure you give the maintainers enough to be able to decide that, yes, this is indeed a bug, or no, it isn't. And you want to have something that's reproducible. And this helps them make an accurate decision, but it also helps you, because if you then make the pull request, you already have your test case built in that you can use. And a very important thing when you're putting in your bug report is that you express your interest in fixing it. So you've effectively claimed it if they say, yes, this is a bug. And this is also the case that you can say, yes, I'd like to work on this if you agree this is a bug, but I'm not sure how to get started. Can you give me some pointers? And that would also be a great spot to put that. Okay, so the final strategy is to propose and implement a new feature. So once again, we've gone more complicated. You really need to understand the pain points or heavily use something to get to this step. And in my case, I mentioned back when I did that first sprint learning about pre-commit and NumPy-doc. And when I was surprised to see that there was no NumPy-doc pre-commit hook, especially with the way that scikit-learn was trying to use it. So I made my own pre-commit hook for NumPy-doc. And eventually I approached the NumPy doc people via GitHub, so I put in a feature request, and I asked them if they had any interest in that. Now, no one on the team was familiar with making pre-commit hooks, right? So that's something that the maintainers would be very interested in, but not interested in doing themselves, right? So that's where you saying, volunteering that you're going to do something also pushes up the priority and makes something like that more likely to be included. And just like with the issue, they're putting in the bug report, you have to make sure that this hasn't already been suggested. This is a little harder to check for because you might call something very different from someone else, but just do a best effort to check open and closed issues that this isn't already there. And then when you put in your feature request, again, you want to be very detailed so that they can make an informed decision of whether they want to include that, whether it makes sense for the project or not. And again, you're going to volunteer to do it. You have vested interest in getting this included because it's something that affects you, that would make your life easier. So volunteer to do that. And it's very, very important at this stage that you don't take things personally. It's possible that you have a fantastic idea, but it just doesn't fit with the project, or it's not something that they want to maintain. So be very polite with all of your interactions. This is all public. And I would strongly suggest that you don't work on anything until they agree that, yes, they want to pursue that. Okay, so those were the 5 strategies. And I mentioned before that they were in an order of least experience with the project to the most experience with the project. But I want to emphasize that there's no best strategy. All of these are valid. All of these can be used successfully. And that it's just picking what makes sense for you. So no contribution is too small. So once you have something you're going to work on, now let's talk about how to have success making your first contribution. I'm going to say this again because it's important to emphasize this. Claim what you're working on. Comment in the issue, say that you're working on something, and also ask if you need any help. If the project provides any setup instructions for getting your dev environment working, be sure to follow those exactly. You might find that there's issues in there, or maybe it hasn't been updated in a while, and now that is your first pull request before you even work on something else. If you are completely new to development, as in Git and GitHub are very new, focus on documentation that removes one of the variables of worrying about your development environment. If you can attend a sprint, like tomorrow or perhaps a meetup, definitely suggest doing that just to get experience with that. And once again, being polite and patient in all interactions, right? Many maintainers are working on this outside of work. So if you put in a pull request and you don't get a response that day or the next day, don't panic, don't spam them, give them time, they will get back to you. And you can politely bump it up, but you don't want to be like every day, right? Okay. So, and then once you have that first pull request in, this is how you can keep up the momentum. So one of the things, and I alluded to this before, is there's lots of opportunities where you can cross-pollinate ideas between projects. So for example, I learned about pre-commit setup from scikit-learn, and then I went to some smaller projects that didn't have it but could clearly benefit from it and shared that knowledge. So there's going to be a lot of things that you might pick up on one side that you can then bring somewhere else. And the same thing as you would maybe pick up something from an open source project and then bring it internally to your team at work. You can also help others contribute. So for example, when I talked about the meta issues in scikit-learn, there was a lot of PRs that will have similar elements to them. So once you have your first ones merged, you can actually review other people's PRs. You can go in and see, oh, what are other people working on? And maybe you see someone has the CI failing, and you know why. You can comment about how they can fix it. And this is a fantastic way to get noticed by the maintainers. They will start seeing your name pop up more in the pull requests or in the reviewing. And it might even lead to getting an invitation to join the core developers so that they can see that you're clearly dedicated. Another nice benefit of that is if you go to other conferences, you may meet some of the maintainers that you've interacted with previously only online. And I've had the opportunity to meet some from Matplotlib and Pandas at conferences last year. So stick with it. And this is actually how I became a core developer for NumPy doc, right? I contributed the pre-commit hook. I did some more work around that. And then I was clearly dedicated and invested in having a big part, and that hook has become pretty popular. So they invited me to come on and be part of that maintainers group. Okay, so I hope I inspired you to start your open source journey. If you do make contributions, or perhaps you go to the sprint, I'd love to hear about it. On the right side, I have links for you to follow my work, or to also just follow on social. And on the left, it's a QR code for feedback, and let me know what you thought of this talk, as well as the slides. So I'll take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefanie, for the amazing presentation. We have very short of time. If you have any questions or queries, I'll pick few. Please raise your hand. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the amazing talk. I wanted to know how were you able to find out about the sprints that were happening, and how do you get connected to those? And my question is coming from the background that most of this project work, open source communities are driven mainly towards English language speaking countries, right? So for countries like Japan, that could be one of the challenge on getting involved in those community. Any advices on that?
So I think probably one thing is, if you're interested in that, maybe reaching out to the conference organizers and potentially helping organize something like that yourself. I've only previously done sprints as part of conferences, and I had gone to some conferences that had sprints and just not attended because I didn't know really what it was, and it took asking some colleagues to figure out if that was something that would be worth my time. But in general, you're going to have to get involved and make it happen if you're interested. And Iqbal will also be a good person to chat with.
Hello, thank you for your talk. From your description, I kind of got the impression that the type of contribution you're suggesting, oftentimes, unless you go to a sprint, oftentimes is on your own. Mm-hmm. And maybe some communication with the maintainers. I guess one of the benefits of contributing, it seems to me, just kind of thinking about it, is if you can interact with them, or if you can kind of learn something as you do it. Can you speak a bit about, did that process happen with you?
Yeah, I think even when it was not like physically interacting, you still learn things, because each project will do things a little differently. And then you're coming from a corporate environment where that's also another thing where things are being done differently. You have people collaborating across continents, then you have some where it's just one person, right? So you kind of get different flavors of like looking at the code. How are they structuring their test suite? How do they use GitHub Actions? How do they coordinate? Do they have meetings, whatever? And just poking through the code base, what kind of tools do they use? Yeah, you can learn so much by looking through. You kind of have to focus when you first go into certain things. And a lot of it is like figuring out, oh, they're using a tool to do this. Oh, I wonder what that does. And like that's things that you maybe wouldn't have found out about if you just if you just did what you were normally doing. It's having the exposure to all the different things.
Okay, so thank you for your presentation, and I want to ask you, what is your purpose of contributing OSS? Because currently I'm a university student and I'm working as an engineer, and I thought and I have never contributed any OSS or open source stuffs, and I thought contributing on open source is very good thing, and it might useful for even others, because they might have been facing same errors or bugs. But the thing is what if a person is spending more than, for example, if a person is spending more than 40 hours or something in a week and they're not getting any incomes or any money, how would they do that? And that doesn't make any sense, I thought. So actually, I'm a beginner engineer and I'm not understanding the engineering world. So I don't know, for example, there might be some companies that contribute on open source projects and get money or something, but so I want to know what the purpose and how people would do that. Thank you.
So I think everyone has their own journey. Some people might just do it because they're just passionate about it, or they're building something that they're using and then it just happens that other people are using it. And you don't have to do it 40 hours, right? If you do, 3 hours in a year, whatever, that's your journey. It doesn't matter. You get whatever you want out of it. Now, there are people that work a lot on it, and some actually technically I think do it full time, and there is some sponsor arrangement, or they have a company that they technically work for that then sponsors the project. We can talk after if you want some names, but in general, you're going to have a wide variety of things. I think it's just key to do what works for you and not get burnt out. If you do enjoy doing it, make sure you set limits for yourself.
Thank you, Stefanie, for your presentation. Please give a huge round of applause for her amazing session.